If you want to learn to knit but don't know where to start, then this video is for you. This isn't a video about how to knit, it's about how to get started when you don't know anything about knitting. Hello, my name's Clarissa and I'm an aspiring clothes maker. This is part one of a two-part series where I will show you how to knit garments from knowing absolutely nothing about knitting. Step 1. Choose a project. You might be wondering, what? I'm not ready for a project. I don't even know where to start. But hear me out. I think the best way to learn all skills, both basic and advanced, is to try them out in a project. Working towards an end product is more motivating, rewarding, and ultimately more useful. The project doesn't have to be a garment. You can start off really simple and easy. You can search for beginner dish or face cloth projects on YouTube. There are loads. I'll link to a few in the description below. It's important to choose a project where size doesn't matter. Sizing will require a bit more thought and we just want to get the basics down for now. So a dishcloth or a face cloth is a good one using cotton yarn, or maybe a scarf if you want to use wool. But given that it's supposed to be spring in Scotland, I'm going to suggest making a face cloth or a dishcloth. When choosing a pattern, make sure you learn to cast on, bind off, knit, and purl. You'll likely need to learn to cast on and bind off, but I would suggest learning both the basic stitches of knitting and purling. I think getting to grips with both basic stitches on your first project gives you just the right amount of challenge. Once you know these skills, you can make anything, and I mean anything. Starting off with a project that has a video tutorial is the easiest way to learn to knit. Someone will walk you through every little step you need to know to complete the project. I couldn't find a project that has a video tutorial that teaches you all the skills in one video, so you may have to search for other videos that will teach you the specific skill. I'll link to some tutorials for specific skills as well. You may also want to find a project that has an accompanying written pattern. That way you can also start figuring out how to read them already. I think knitting patterns are a different language altogether. When choosing a knitting tutor, you'll need to know that there are generally two ways to knit: continental or English style. I don't really know why they're called that. Continental knitting is where you hold your working yarn with your left hand, and English style throwing or flicking is where you hold the working yarn with your right hand. I knit continental, that's just what I was taught. I don't think there's one that's better than the other or faster or whatever. You just need to choose which one you'd like to learn. Step 2. Gather your materials. You'll need to list the materials that you need based on the project you've chosen. Some tutorials will just tell you what you'll need, and others will have an accompanying written pattern which will list the materials for you. Normally, you'll just need yarn, knitting needles, and a tapestry needle. You can use whatever yarn or needles the tutor used. They'll also probably give you some other options as well. If those aren't accessible to you, I think the easiest thing to do is to go to your local yarn shop and see what they have and can recommend for you. You can show them the list of materials and say, I want to make this is what I need. Can you help me find everything? They should be able to help you find substitute materials that are accessible to you. And when I say accessible, I mostly mean what you can afford. They'll also be able to give you some advice on what materials would be most beginner friendly. You can also choose to figure it out yourself. When choosing yarn that's different from what the tutor recommended, find yarn that is more or less the same composition and weight as the recommended yarn. Composition is just the material of the yarn, so it could be wool, cotton, acrylic, alpaca. Weight means whether it's DK, worsted, fingering. There's just all sorts of these categories. Just choose whatever is more or less the same as what the tutor gave. Because size doesn't matter, you also don't need to be very exact. So for example, Norman of Nimble Needles, who is my favorite knitting tutor, he recommended 100% cotton yarn that's worsted weight. In this situation, because it's a dishcloth, I would recommend 100% cotton as well, just because it's more absorbent and it's gonna be more useful that way. What you can do is to filter search for these categories and choose whatever color you like and whatever yarn you can afford. You will only need one ball of yarn. You can also probably use Aran weight or DK weight, but in that case, I would suggest that you use the needle size recommended in the label of the yarn and not the one recommended in the pattern or tutorial. Hopefully that change in light isn't too jarring. For needles, I would recommend wooden or bamboo needles. This is how I learned, and I think they're easier to use because the yarn won't slip off your needles so easily. I would also recommend using circular needles rather than straight needles. Straight needles are the needles you would assume knitters use all the time. It's what you see in the movies. But especially if you want to learn to knit clothes, you'll need to learn to knit in the round, and you'll need circular needles for that. Circular needles are more versatile because you can knit flat, which is the same as knitting on straight needles, or you can knit in the round. They're also a lot more comfortable to use because you're not therefore having to carry big sticks. Look for fixed circular needles. You don't need an interchangeable set right now. That's way too much for starting out. You can use the needle size recommended in the pattern or by the tutor, or you can use the needle size that's recommended in the yarn label that you purchased. Now, if you don't want to go through all this faff, you can use a kit if you can afford it. Wool in the Gang and We Are Knitters are really popular for that, and your local yarn shop might have kits as well. Just make sure to filter for beginner projects. Step 3. Start knitting. You can learn these skills from books, blogs, YouTube videos, family, or friends. I have favorite YouTubers that I learn new skills from. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, is Norman from Nimble Needles. Absolute legend. He gives such clear instructions, things are on slow-mo, and he gives you tips on how to remember what to do. He also has really educational videos on knitting tips, which I find really, really useful. The other YouTuber that really was the one that got me started knitting again is Kika of the Kutova Kika channel. She makes really nice and aesthetically pleasing videos. She's a knitwear designer and I have knit a couple of her patterns already. But her videos are just such a joy to watch, even if I knew already how to do the things that she was doing. They both teach knitting the continental way, which is how I knit. There are also a lot of videos that can teach you English throwing style or flicking, but because I knit continental, I don't really watch those videos, so I can't really recommend anyone. My first knitting project ever was a scarf that I knit flat on bamboo needles. It was a plain basic stockinette stitch scarf. No, I think it was ribbed. No, it must have been stockinette. Stockinette it's really confusing because it's a knit stitch and you're also knitting. Stockinette is knitting one row with a knit stitch, turning your work over, and then knitting another row in purl stitch. And then this would result in like a plain bit of fabric. One side is... No, it was definitely ribbed. So I knit 2 and purl 2, and knit 2 and purl 2. I used straight needles. This was in Japan. It was a really lovely classmate of mine that taught me how to knit. I remember her face, and I remember her last name, but not her first name. So I haven't spoken to her since I left in 2003. Yeah, that's how I learned to knit. No YouTube, no pattern. I hope that was helpful. In part 2, I'll be sharing with you some tips on how to start knitting your first garment. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!